The one that I teach by myself is Geoscience and the American Landscape. It's an honors-only course, introductory geology for honors students. And we take the national parks as a theme for final presentations and study. So that's one that I do. The second one that I do by myself now is teach an online version of the basic course, Earth's Dynamic Environment. That's general geology, the whole thing, how the Earth works, soup to nuts, beginning to end, alpha to omega of geology, introductory geology. And that is the second course that I teach all by myself. Others can teach the course now that it's designed, but I don't share the teaching load. Beyond that, I'm mostly advisory on the introductory curriculum. I piloted a hybrid version of Earth's Dynamic Environment lecture with a couple hundred students, and we learned a lot in doing that. We learned that they want more lecture, and that interested me. But that course is about how the Earth works, and it's an introduction to Earth system science, and it's an attempt to try and do away with the spheres. This is my personal opinion. You know, the hydrosphere and the biosphere and the lithosphere, they're so integrated that I believe that using those terms is counterproductive in terms of learning how the planet works these days. So that's the second, that's the course that I am sort of involved in overseeing and supervising and training. That's general geology. The lab component of that course is one thing that I haven't ever taught by myself, but I wrote the lab manual, the textbook, the training guide for the TAs, and the things that students see in the student's assignment. And the whole thing was put online to save the students the money of buying the textbooks, which were, you don't really need a textbook for a laboratory exercise. And we redesigned those. That was our biggest project. We got funding from 3 or 4 sources on campus, including GEOC, the General Education Oversight Committee, in order to make that thing really lively. And we redesigned the entire thing, threw away the old lab manual approach, and have a sense of engagement where they work with 44 different setups over 11 labs. That's 4 per lab. And then they do 2 long field trips, which have all kinds of learning objectives built into them. And so I'm sort of overseeing that. But the TAs do most of the delivery on the teaching, and our assistant professor in residence does the oversight of the TAs when they teach it. However, I do supervise the head TA, who's responsible for setting it up. Well, aside from the other things of general education, and just focusing on the geosciences, one of the most pressing questions we have is, how does the Earth work? Well, the biologists are masters of a piece of it, and the atmospheric scientists are masters of a piece, and the marine scientists are masters of a piece. And what we're trying to do in introductory geology is give you a very fundamental view about the whole planet works, because there's no way you can make rocks without the atmosphere and the marine and the water and the biosphere. In fact, a lot of minerals post-date oxygenation of the atmosphere. I mean, that it's life that creates the oxygen in the atmosphere that creates the minerals. It's all connected. And so a student walks out of there, has a pretty good idea of how the Earth works as a system, and they have a pretty good idea of how the Earth is a planet in the solar system, because it's simply one version of being a planet in our solar system. It's a very interesting version. And then another thing they get out of it is I think they understand what geologists do. You know, they find oil, they find coal, they find mineral, they find uraniums, and a lot of them get rich doing that. Another thing they do is they protect watersheds, they understand rivers, they understand rates of change, they understand response to catastrophes in a way that nobody else does. In fact, the finance majors are starting to merge with the geoscientists into sort of geo-risks. You know, sort of, I mean, basically the whole insurance business is based on actuarial statistics about how often stuff happens. Well, if we're in a different world, we need to know how that world is behaving differently from the preceding one, and rates of shoreline change, rates of river sedimentation, rates of delta growth, rates of subsidence. We just learned that the western part of the Mississippi Delta is subsiding 4 times faster, you know, than the rest of the world. And we know why. It has to do with subsidence, dewatering, compaction, and slight fault slips in the direction that made the Gulf the way it is. In addition to sea level rise, in addition to a faster sea level rise because the water is warmer. So the whole idea is if you want to study wetlands on the Gulf Coast of the United States, and you want to understand why they are being threatened by rising sea level, it's very important to understand the geologic underpinnings of that physical change, which then leads to the ecological changes that tend to drive most people's interest. Well, I wouldn't be a geologist if it weren't for the general education curriculum, because I walked into it, I had no idea that there was actually an academic subject in something that I cared this much about. And here I am decades later, still leaping out of bed in the morning to go do this thing. Without general education, I would have never found my career path. I wouldn't have been exposed to things that I didn't know that I was keenly interested in. The second thing that happened in general education for me is I get to mingle and hang out with and be with people from all parts of the university when I was a student. And I found that immensely satisfying. It was the way in which I got to know other people, other majors, other orientations to the world. And I found that to be exceptionally helpful when I was a beginning college student. And it's amazing how much I remember being in general ed myself several decades ago. Another thing that's value of general education is that to have a literate society, a scientifically literate society, you have to be able to assume that another college educated person over there knows certain things, or you can't have a conversation that is effective. And well, effective in a way that that is on the table for conversation. And so general education is sort of a great leveler. And I think that knowing that everybody has some exposure to the humanities and has some exposure to sciences, has some exposure to being living in a diverse world, having some exposure to the fine arts, it's really, really helpful to know that that's what the college graduate has, because you can start the interaction in a more interesting plane.